Welcome down the rabbit hole, friends. Katie Joy Paulson is oddly enmeshed with Gypsy Rose Blanchard, or at least she's trying to be. And meanwhile, Katie Joy is all over Instagram, calling out a woman named Fancy Maselli for her own enmeshment with Gypsy Rose's family. This is so toxic.
But there were just these emails and craziness. And we're going to read some of those emails back and forth between some of our team and myself included, and Gypsy, and in our later episodes. But again, we kept going because we decided long ago this story was more than just the Gypsy Rose Blanchard story. It was the story of all the kids suffering at the hands of abusive parents, and the story needed to be told in its entirety.
But most of us, we remember when several years ago, Katie Joy Paulson was caught on video interacting with Fancy Maselli. I guess they were trying to work together regarding the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case.
Developmentally delayed and should not be in prison.
Not as much as people think.
Not as much as people think.
That is really, the specialists have all contradicted themselves. When you read emails that he does, he is intelligent.
But that doesn't, you can be intelligent and autistic.
Yeah, no, autistic, absolutely. No, not the same, no.
But he's not developmentally slow in any means, no.
But autism is considered a developmental disability.
It's considered a neurological disability.
No, it affects all aspects of development. My son is autistic, so
do you believe that your son could be manipulated into murdering somebody?
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
Why? And where is your son at on the spectrum?
He's high functioning.
He's high functioning. Why do you think that could happen?
Because they're vulnerable.
Because you're actually the first one that we've talked to that has said that.
I think anyone that has autism can be manipulated because they're vulnerable.
Have you seen his actual text messages and his words?
Nick's?
Yes.
Not all of them, no.
Yeah, they're pretty scary.
Well, he is absolutely developmentally delayed and should.
So, allegedly now, Katie Joy Paulson is saying that she completely disavows Fancy Maselli, claiming that Fancy was never good friends with the family and has done horrible things to Gypsy and her parents. Katie Joy is taking a stand on Instagram and letting everyone know that she fully supports Gypsy and considers herself a close friend of the family. But let's look at what Fancy is saying through her posts on her social media, making ongoing accusations towards Gypsy and Christy, her stepmom. Okay, so this is a look at a post which we started in my last video. This post is from Fancy Maselli on her Good Wives podcast Facebook page. Let's take a look at the additional accusations Fancy is making. So here Fancy is asking us to ask ourselves why she turned on Gypsy. She says she's her biggest supporter. Why would she lose confidence in her? She writes, you have to ask yourselves why. Why did her biggest supporters turn? Wouldn't you think that would be a pretty big reason? And no, it's not because her half-sister Mia called me out on TikTok, LOL. The reason we turned was because the lies had finally all come out. We finally had the interrogation video they tried to hide from us. We had the medical records and discovery file. As we began to investigate the evidence tells us a drastically different story. And don't come here saying we never put it out. We have put out more on this case than 90 other places. Where you have to start with this case is by throwing out anything and everything you've heard or seen and only look at the facts and evidence. Everything else is a distraction. The only person you can't believe more than Gypsy is Christy. She is a snake in the grass. She convinced Rod to not only not be there for Gypsy, but also give up rights to another child a few months different in age from Gypsy. Only her kids mattered. This man never tried for visitation even once. Okay, guys, and here's what Fancy Maselli shockingly has to say about Rod and Christy, Gypsy's dad and stepmom, that I have never heard before. If you go to Fancy Maselli's page, she talks about the relationship between Christy and Dee Dee Blanchard. So according to Fancy, and she says this all comes directly from Christy, she has evidence of emails and other things that she's received from Christy talking about this. According to Christy and other family friends, Dee Dee met and got pregnant with Gypsy while she was working as a nurse's aide at the hospital. And Christy was working as a receptionist in the same unit. This is how Rod met Christy. He started messing around with Christy on the side and left Dee Dee while she was pregnant with Gypsy to get with Christy. Not only that, but allegedly during that time, he got another woman pregnant. This is all according to Fancy. Christy told Fancy that she and Rod were together the night that Gypsy Rose was born. She actually said they were at a fishing rodeo together because Rod, like, that's his job. He's a fisherman. They were at a fishing rodeo together. They came home. They were totally, I guess, like wasted and just really, really tired from the day when they got a phone call at night saying that Gypsy had been born and they had to go to the hospital together. This is interesting to me. Like, I'm not trying to be too judgmental. Who knows what was going on between Rod and Dee Dee, but it seems so fast, so quick, and there's a lot of drama going on here. Things that we've never been made aware of before. I mean, I really want to be happy for Gypsy that she has Christy. I really want to be happy that her father is going to be in her life, but I also understand the questions that Fancy is asking. So then Fancy writes, even if you feel bad for Gypsy, you can't trust what she says. She was taught by one of the best con families I've ever seen. She even admits it in the documentaries. I've never told the truth, not even to my attorneys. My mom taught me to be a good liar, to lie with no conscience. That's her own admission, and she did no things in prison to get any real help for any of this. And her family didn't encourage it either, but they sure as shit supported her dating and getting engaged to a slew of guys while supposedly never having any type of normal life or interactions with people. Great parents. Okay, so this is where Fancy seems to really diverge from Christy in her own story. Like, she says that she was okay with the family getting along with Gypsy and Christy until Gypsy met a new guy, and this was the first guy that she got engaged to while she was in prison. According to Fancy and her team had a real problem with this. They were trying to coach Gypsy and I guess Christy and everyone else that Gypsy should not get involved with any men, that she needed help, that she needed to get therapy. They had their own thoughts, and maybe they were, like, it seems to me, trying to be controlling of what happened with Gypsy, and they are hyper critical of Christy and her dad, for sure. Okay, so then Fancy starts going down this rabbit hole, basically saying, like, if you want to hold Dee Dee accountable for her crimes, shouldn't you also hold Gypsy accountable as well? Which I think isn't really fair based upon everything that we know, even though I do believe Munchausen's was passed down through the family. I mean, what Gypsy suffered, there's just no comparison to what happened to her. And she was indoctrinated, almost like being in a cult, from the time she was born to play along with all these games. But here's what Fancy has to say. But if you want to absolve Gypsy of her crimes, then why not take it a step further and absolve Dee Dee too, as she was doing exactly what her mother did to her, to Gypsy. If you aren't willing to make that jump for Dee Dee, then you can't make it for Gypsy either. You can't selectively decide Dee Dee was awful despite the fact that her mom did the same thing and say Gypsy isn't. That's like having your cake and eating it too. Dee Dee doesn't deserve forgiveness. What she did to Gypsy is abuse. We have never denied that. But what we have said is that here's where Fancy wants to argue that Gypsy and Dee Dee, they didn't really suffer from Munchausen's by proxy. Instead, Fancy wants to call it child abuse. And this is because Fancy believes, based upon some research that she's done, from what I understand from her podcast, that a lot of the procedures that Gypsy claims were done or Dee Dee said were done were actually just like a medical fraud situation where people were paid to do certain things, but they didn't actually happen. It's very complicated, and I can't imagine how Fancy could even prove any of this, since Gypsy herself was like heavily medicated the entire time. How would Gypsy really know what's going on? Plus, she was a child. And then Dee Dee's gone, so she can't give us the information as well. But Fancy does make a strong case on her podcast that perhaps there were doctors working with Dee Dee who were filing claims for certain things to be done that weren't done to Gypsy. It is not Munchausen's by proxy. It's not. And there's even controversy in the psychological community as to what MPB actually is. Is it a mental illness or just a means of child abuse? I believe the latter. There are very good reasons that it's not in the DSM-5 as a mental illness. Listing it as such would give the abusers a way out, a way to justify their action. They aren't ill. They are sociopaths. Created or not, it's what they are. In my opinion, and that of several other experts on Munchausen's by proxy, this is something else, even by standards of Munchausen's by proxy. But beyond that, it's child abuse any way you shake it. Is it what everyone thinks? No. Gypsy was groomed. Hell, so was Dee Dee. And from what I know, this goes back generations in this family. It didn't start with Dee Dee and Gypsy, and it doesn't end with them either. And when Gypsy crossed the line from victim to perpetrator was when... Okay, so here's where Fancy is going to put out her theory that, like, look, Gypsy is responsible for her crimes as well, and that she did manipulate Nicholas Godejohn into participating in this crime with her, and that she is guilty when it comes to responsibility for the murder of her mother. You know, this is Fancy's opinion about it. It's really hard for me to see things this way. I understand why people do see it that way. From my point of view, like I said, she was held captive. And I just want to point out that Fancy's opinion changed over time as the family decided not to work with her as much, you know, based upon Fancy's own telling of the story. So we do have to wonder, like, if she would be then biased in how she views Gypsy. For me, I definitely think that it would create a lot of bias if you were looking to do a documentary and work with this family to achieve greater social media fame, and then they decide to go in a different direction with other people. But when Gypsy crossed the line from victim to perpetrator was when she started manipulating a very disturbed, very sheltered autistic guy on the internet to take her mom's life. She used every skill and tactic her mama taught her on him. At this point, after reading all the medical records that Gypsy herself signed for us to have, I can't be certain of what was or wasn't performed and what was or wasn't just billed. Colleen, a nurse practitioner and a nursing school teacher, detailed each procedure and surgery in great detail in our podcast. But at that time, we were still operating under the idea of some of this has to be true. Instead of looking at it from the point of view that, is it even true? Is any of this true? But she does a very thorough job explaining what was in these files. It wasn't until this year that I truly sat down again with these medical files after discussing it with another creator on our team, someone who's been around since the beginning. She wanted to know about salivary glands because if they were removed, she couldn't spit or lick her lips, and yet Gypsy can. So I pulled it out and found lots of Botox injections and one reduction of them, but not a removal. So here again, Fancy is going to make this crazy argument that essentially, you know, all the information is not out there. It's not true what's out there about Gypsy. According to Fancy, it's kind of like Gypsy and her family and her team, they're not exposing like everything that happened. And so here she says, these are not irregular documents, folks, regarding Gypsy's medical documents. I've never seen doctors' notes that look like these. In every document, the tests are negative. And yes, there are so many negative tests, it's insane. But yet the next page would be the procedure they just stated she didn't need. The word malingering is used several times, not just by one doctor, several. And yet nobody does a damn thing. If you read these, there is no question that it was a long con with doctors involved. So this is a big part of Fancy's argument on her podcast, is that she believes there's one specific doctor whose name she doesn't give in the podcast that I've listened to, who was working in tandem with Dee Dee. And actually, she claims that this doctor worked not only with Dee Dee in Louisiana, but then somehow shows up when she's in Missouri, helping Dee Dee like get procedures done, get medications, is prescribing things to her. And Fancy questions if there was some kind of relationship between Dee Dee and this doctor, though she doesn't have any evidence to support that. Guys, this is so crazy. We're not even done with this one post from Fancy. And yes, it is proven that she at least communicated somewhat with Christy and this family. So some of this, it does come out of research that Fancy has done. Now, whether or not I agree with all of it, I certainly don't agree with parts of it. I don't agree with Fancy's take on Gypsy at all. And, I welcome any opinions, thoughts, and feelings that other people have, but this is such a crazy rabbit hole I didn't even realize existed, except I knew that Katie Joy was involved in all these crazy shenanigans in some way, shape, or form, and now I'm finding out what this is all about. All right, so I'm going to stop this video here, and I will pick up again later, so please join me as we head down yet another rabbit hole, trying to figure out what's going on here with Gypsy Rose Blanchard.